I am so grateful and to be asked to chair this meeting and to get to introduce you Joe H. from Santa Monica, California.
My name is Joe. I'm an alcoholic. It's good to be here. I want to thank you for inviting me. I think it's that connection that Don was talking about that really means so very much to me in my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous. When I was in Seattle in July, I had to speak in front of about 6,000 people, and I think I was a little bit more nervous today because some people that are here, there's a man that I've always admired from afar. He was not in Denver when I got sober, and you always heard a lot about him in Denver, and he's my sponsor, Gary B. from Indianapolis. But I go to my room and I get quiet for a minute, and I remember that we're just all a bunch of drunks, and all I need to do is share my experience. I remember the first time when I was upstairs, I remembered the first time I was ever asked to do this, to speak in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was about 7 months sober. I had just spent about 7 hours that day reading my first fifth step to Don, and he was the state delegate for Colorado at the time, and I was used to going all over the state with him, and he said he was going to a meeting across town in Denver, and would I come with him? And I think I even read some more inventory on the way, and I'm, just kind of overwhelmed by all this, and hadn't been around that long, and we get to this big church that I'd never been to on the west side of Denver, and we're walking in, and he says, "I forgot to tell you something." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You're speaking first." And I walk in that church, and there's about 200 or 300 people, and for Denver, that's a big meeting. And I said, "How do you do that?" Like I had been asking for several months. He never had some cliche for me. I never felt sloughed off. He said, "Go in the bathroom and say a prayer and see what happens." And I went in the bathroom and I said a prayer, and I came out and I stood in front of that crowd, and I experienced the promises in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous at the end of the fifth step that I had never even read before I was done with my fifth step. I went home the next day, finished reading my inventory, and read those promises, and every single one of them had absolutely come true. I was able to look those people in the eye. I was not a speaker when I came here, nor can I do this on my own. I did the same thing today upstairs in the room. I was very withdrawn when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. In my last treatment center, they would not let me go to group therapy. They wouldn't let me go to group therapy for two reasons. One, I had been a therapist and I could play the game, and they knew I could play the game. And two, I couldn't talk to more than one person at a time, and I could barely talk to one person. This is something that's happened for me as a direct result of the recovery process outlined in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't have any friends when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. My very last friend in the world had given up on me. And today I have some friends. It's an amazing thing. And I haven't been here that long. I just celebrated my 8th birthday, and it seemed like at every birthday there were always people up to 2 weeks ago. There were always people in the room that excite me and that challenge me and that tell me the truth, even though that always doesn't feel good. But there were always some people in the room that told me the next year was going to be a little worse. The sky was probably going to fall in within my 5th year or my 4th year or whatever the next year was, and maybe I was rushing this thing a little bit too much, and they were always trying to hold me back in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for some reason, and I don't think it has much to do with God, although everything does, I drank enough alcohol. I think the only testament to me being excited about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is like a friend of mine said on my 5th birthday. You're hearing from a guy who's sick enough to need the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is no testament to my wonderful health, how much I've done in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think it's just a mere fact that I'm sick enough to need the whole program. I sat in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous for my first 5 months thinking I was in AA because I was going to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had left my last treatment center, and I had several things going on in my head because of what I heard in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. That we read the book, we get a sponsor, we work the steps, and we go to meetings. And for some reason, I don't know about you, but my keen alcoholic mind took that and said, those are the things that are going to keep me sober. And in those 5 months, I went to a lot of meetings. If they said 90 meetings in 90 days, I probably went to 3 meetings a day because if one good, 3's better. And that's what I do. Because I drank enough alcohol to need the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. But in those first few months, I sat around and I heard people that went to more meetings than I did drink. And I heard people that read that book a lot more than I did drink. And I heard people that went through the steps and quit doing certain things or forgot certain things drink. And I heard people that had wonderful sponsors drink alcohol again. And I started to get afraid because I thought those were the things that were going to keep me sober. And I had this experience one day looking in a book, not this book, just a book on art. And it was a picture of the Sistine Chapel with the painting Michelangelo did of the finger pointing to God. And I started to think about that. And of course I was thinking about someone out here other than myself. And I thought about people that go to church. And I'd always heard about worshiping the church rather than God. And this thought came to me, that's what you're doing in Alcoholics Anonymous. You're worshiping every finger that everyone ever gave you, and you can't even see what it's pointing to. Because I had worshipped those meetings, and I had worshipped a sponsor, and I started to worship this book, even when I got into it, thinking that those were the things that were going to keep me sober. And I reached a point 5.5 months sober that I would really rather drink again than ever be like. And the only reason I can say that is because I absolutely know I don't ever have to be like that again. I woke up one day 5.5 or 6 months sober. It's still foggy. As much has been revealed about my past, and as much as I've seen about my early days in AA, I still don't know exactly when that was. And I was given the grace to see the nature of my condition further away from my last drink than I had ever been. I had never been sober for 28 days in 17 years. And I was 5.5 months dry. Further away from my last drink than I had ever been, and I was worse. Not out here. Things were pretty good. Had a lot of new friends in AA. Loved the fellowship. New place to live. New girlfriend. Little bank account. Little car. Didn't have to work for a while. And I was dying of untreated alcoholism, and I didn't know that. And I started to search for something. And I remembered a man that I heard in my very first meeting. And he had told my story, but I knew he wasn't like me anymore. And it was so scary, I waited till the next week in that treatment center, and I picked somebody totally opposite. And I asked him to be my sponsor. God bless him. He did the very best he could. He sat in a room with me one day and he said, "Are you powerless over alcohol?" And I said, "Yeah, because don't you see, my life has been a mess." And he went for that. He said, "Is your life unmanageable?" And I said, "Don't you see, my life is a mess." And I was looking at the outsides. He said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "Yes." Little did he know that it was a punishing God that was going to strike me down as soon as I was a bad AA member. And he opened the book and he read some stupid prayer. I didn't have a clue what it meant. And he sent me home out of that treatment center with a mimeograph sheet on how to write inventory. And I started going to a lot of meetings because it was the first time I ever left treatment without an answer, without a plan. Matter of fact, I sat in that treatment center for 30 days and I watched people graduate. They'd pat them on the back, give them a little diploma, a little certificate, tell them everything was fine, and they'd go on their way, and it was my day to graduate. And the director of that program looked at me, God bless him, Dr. Larry. And he said, "Joe, you have about as much chance as a snowball in hell unless you find a program of recovery to show you how to live the rest of your life, because you don't do real well with drugs and alcohol, and you don't do real well without them." And I left that treatment center scared to death, and I didn't have a plan for the first time in my life, and I had been to 10 treatment centers. So I get this guy, and I try to write this inventory, and I get to a part of the inventory where it asks me to look at my part in all these resentments. And I couldn't do it. I could not do it. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I could not write that inventory. And I put it down. And I lied. And I told him I was writing. And I woke up one day a couple months later and reached a point in Alcoholics Anonymous that was the worst day I've ever experienced and the best day I've ever experienced, because I was ready for the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and I had not found it in the fellowship by itself. The fellowship got me excited, but it wasn't happening for me. I'm one of these drunks where it doesn't get better when I stop drinking, and I had an idea that alcoholism began and ended with my last drink. And it began with my first drink. I've seen neither one of those things are true. If my alcoholism ended with my last drink, I certainly wouldn't be here 8 years later in Nashville, Tennessee. I would be off doing wonderful things for myself. And I've written enough inventory to find out it did not start at my first drink. There is a part of my disease described in this big book that was in full bloom before I ever took a drink. The root of my disease. And I'm grateful for that day. I heard another man describe it better than I can, this day that I reached in sobriety. He said, there came a day in Alcoholics Anonymous where I couldn't pull off on purpose what I used to do by mistake. And I understood him when he said that, because I used to pull off some unbelievable stuff by mistake. Drinking. Relationships, money, deals, trips. Getting out of scrapes. And I reached a point in sobriety where I couldn't pull that stuff off on purpose. And I wanted to. Something was wrong. And here I am, once again, in the middle of the program that's supposed to save my ass, with the same question that was in the back of my mind when I got here. Because you know what? It hadn't been answered. What's wrong with me? They tell me if I keep coming back, it's going to get better. They throw these cliches around at me that just make me madder than hell. You're in some terrible dilemma, and it's usually about a relationship or a woman, and you're in a meeting, and you're whining and crying, and you share this terrible problem, and some old guy in the back of the room says, "This too shall pass." And you want to take him and you want to just strangle him. Because it wasn't passing. It was getting progressively worse. And I went out to his house, Don's house, that day. He says he told me that I had to wait 6 weeks. I don't think it was 6 weeks. But I think he wanted to see how serious I was. And I went out to his house, and he said he only knew one way to do it. And that was to start at the title page and go through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous together. And we started to do that. And you know, that day when he talked to me about the title page of Alcoholics Anonymous big book, I learned more about AA than I had in 5.5 or 6 months sitting around in meetings. I don't know if I wouldn't been able to hear. I don't know if I was ready to hear. But I heard more that day when he talked to me about 3 parts of a program that I wasn't in than I had in the whole time I'd been in AA. When he talked to me about unity, and he asked me where do I think that we find that, and I told him that I have found that in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have felt that from time to time, but it isn't enough. I'm dying. He said, what about recovery? Where do you find that? I gave some smart answer. I said, on the wall. He said, no, they really kind of made a mistake when they put the steps on the wall, because they left out the instructions in between, and they left it up to people like you to figure out. And it wasn't happening. And I wasn't in that part of the program. He said the recovery program of Alcoholics Anonymous is found in the big book. And I wasn't in that. He said, what about service? And I got cocky again. I said, that's carrying the message. He says, are you doing that? I said, yeah, I'm taking patients to meetings where I used to go to treatment. He said, oh, you're carrying alcoholics to the message. There's a big difference. And there was another part of the program I wasn't in. So here I am hanging out in 1/3 of a 3-part program, expecting that part of the program to treat the part of the disease that I'm suffering from further away from my last drink than I'd ever been. And it wasn't happening. He asked me, did I know that alcoholism was a 3-part disease, and that there was a part of the disease, a part of the program for each part of my disease. And I had heard that. You bring the body and the mind will follow. And I knew enough. As a matter of fact, when I met Don, I'd been to treatment so many times, I was what they used to call a professional client. And I became such a professional client that I became a professional therapist. There's only one thing to do when you've been to treatment 10 or 12 times. That's become a therapist. And I had done both. Matter of fact, I worked in a long-term treatment center one time where I drank every day with the director of the program that I worked for. I thought everything was just fine. He said, you know, Joe, as a matter of fact, you probably know enough about alcoholism and all this other stuff and yourself to be dangerous to you and everyone around you. Why don't you use a prayer that everything you think you know, especially about God and spiritual matters, be put aside for an open mind and a new experience? And I started to do that prayer because I had drank enough alcohol. And we continued on in that book. Every week I'd go to his house. I went to some new meetings. I got a home group. I learned the importance of having a home group because in that home group I was hearing from people that were going on ahead of me. And when I would talk about what I was going through in the first step, they would say, that's exactly what I went through in the first step. And then they'd piss me off when they were talking about inventory because I wasn't there. It gave me something to go for. I started to meet those people in Alcoholics Anonymous that excite me because their lives continue to change. They continue to go for it. We started looking in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story, and there is a solution and more about alcoholism. And I started to get some answers to that question that had been in the back of my mind since before my first drink. What's wrong with me? There are a couple days that I like to share. One is the day of my daddy's funeral when I was brought from a little white room in a psychiatric unit out to my mother's house by a guard that I was under custody with. And she begged me not to show up drunk at my daddy's funeral. And I said to her with everything I could muster, I won't. I promise you that I won't. And I meant it. And I didn't want to. And I walked across the street to say hello to a friend. And he asked me, did I want to have a beer just to calm down before my father's funeral? And I said, yeah, I'll have one. And somewhere between that one and the 20th one, I lost the power of choice over how much I was going to drink, and I didn't even know that. Until I started to look at the description of the alcoholic in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I got an answer to that day and lots of other days because I drank enough alcohol. I showed up so messed up at my father's funeral, the guard that brought me tied me to a tree by a chain like an animal at my own father's funeral, and I didn't want to do that. And I sat there in that funeral and watched my brothers and sisters and the rest of the family point their fingers at me and say, you killed him. And then got to go back to that room in the psychiatric unit and live with that for a few days more without any alcohol. 2.5 years later, I was released from the Michigan State Penitentiary, and I made my first report to my PO the day I got out. And 28 days later, I hadn't had a drink. And I was doing better. I was feeling better. Family's behind me again. Dear God. You ever have one of those times where the family rises up behind you and you almost want to say to them, please don't believe in me because I'm just going to break your heart again? That's how I was feeling. And I went to his office on the 28th day and he told me everything that I shouldn't do or I'd be sent back to the penitentiary. And one of them was drinking. And one of them was going into a bar. And one of them was being with an ex-felon. And I didn't want to go back to the penitentiary. And on the 28th day, I walked out of his office feeling good, into a bar to buy a pack of cigarettes, picked up a drink, woke up 5 days later 120 miles away with an ex-felon and had broke every condition of my parole and didn't want to. And I got an explanation for that day. They started to talk to me about the symptoms of alcoholism in the first part of the book. What happens to me when I put it in my system? After I take a drink? And what happens to me before I put it in my system? That insanity, the insanity of alcoholism. I remember an exercise they took me through to help me see the insanity. This kind, loving, gentle man asked me to make a list of the 10 craziest things I ever did. And I made this list, and it was pretty dramatic. And every one of them was under the influence of alcohol. And he shook his head and he said, "Son, I'll bet you $10,000 that the number one most insane thing you ever did that should be on the top of that list was with nothing in your system, bone dry, at your very best." And they brought me out from behind the bottle. And I saw that at my very best, I commit the most insane act of my life. And that's to pick up another drink based on my history with alcohol. And I saw it in day after day after day after day. And you know, these people in AA that excite me nowadays, that continue to do the work necessary to continue to recover, to continue to have a deeper and more effective spiritual experience, to continue to grow in understanding and effectiveness, these people that I respect in Alcoholics Anonymous, that do this every year or every so often, that excite me to do that. You know the funny thing about doing it on a regular basis? I've done it each year for the last 8 years. And you know it's harder to get back to that 8 years away from my last drink than it was 6 months away from my last drink. I tend to get this idea that the further away I am from my last drink has something to do with how far away I am from my next drink. And I had this experience last year in my inventory where I saw that none of this stuff that I think stands between me and my next drink has anything to do with what stands between me and my next drink. I saw that what I know about this big book has nothing to do with me staying sober. As a matter of fact, it probably gets in the way of me staying sober sometimes. I saw that it's not what I know about God that keeps me sober. I saw that it's my direct experience with God. And what I know about Him usually gets in the way. And it was harder to get back to that desperation of that drinking than it was when it was right on my back. And I need that push to push me through the work. I've seen a lot of people go through these steps at different times in their sobriety based on the unmanageability or the emotional nature they're experiencing at the time or the mess that their life is in, and they get to amends. And things straighten out after making a few amends, and they poop out. They don't make amends because they feel better, or things have straightened out, and they forget why we do the work necessary to recover in Alcoholics Anonymous. I started to see that the unmanageability of my life is not outside of me when they used that page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic and several other descriptions in our book. Restless, irritable, discontent from the doctor's opinion. How well am I doing now, sober? How well was I doing that day when Don and I got to that point with personal relationships? Were they going the way I want? Are they going the way I want now? No. Can I control my emotional nature? Can I cope with my feelings and deal with them? Those are two words Don told me to totally take out of my vocabulary when I got here to Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't want to cope. I don't want to deal with it any longer. I can't. How am I doing with misery and depression? Can I make my living the way I want it to be? Am I full of fear? Am I happy? Can I be of real help to other people? And I'm here to tell you, at 5.5 months, and 1.5 years, and 2.5, and 3.5, and 5.5, and 7.5, I've had to look at that with another alcoholic that I trust, doing it for me, so I can continue to be effective. Because there have become times in Alcoholics Anonymous where it's all stale, and it should be exciting. I had a job one time, and I hadn't worked for 7 years before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and here I am, 1.5 years sober. They made me the director of a prevention program for the National Council on Alcoholism, and I'm wondering, how do I do this? And it was exciting for a little while, which is probably dangerous for me anyway. Several months later, it wasn't exciting anymore, and it should have been, because it was all taken off. And sponsorship wasn't very exciting. And I was on the state committee, treatment center chairman for the state of Colorado, and it wasn't very exciting. And the relationship I was in one of those relationships you can't stay, you can't leave. Kind of like my drinking. And I went back to the work, and it all changed. Once again. All of it became exciting again. Every time I get to the second step, you would think Thank God these steps aren't logical. You know, I got more benefit in looking at the first step. You would think, let's look for every reason why I'm alcoholic. They said, no, why don't you look at all the questions in this book? And that was a major thing they taught me about this book, because I heard in meetings for a long time, you'll find the answers in the big book. They said, no, what you'll find in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous are the questions. The answers are within you and your own experience. Because if you didn't drink this way, there ain't no answer in that. And I started to look at those questions in the chapter to the agnostic and looking at step 2. And you know, a lot of them had to do with, why don't you look at you don't believe? I thought to come to believe, you should see how much you do believe. They said, no, maybe you better look at that you don't. Maybe you better face your honest doubt and prejudice and agnosticism. 6 months sober, 2 years sober, 7.5 years sober. I found some areas of my life that I absolutely did not think God could take me any further. This is it. Beyond here, there is going to be no more. God had all of a sudden become finite, measurable. This is it. And they're supposed to ask me to look at God as either everything or He's nothing. I got more benefit considering the idea, after seeing the first step, after coming to that admission of desperation and hopelessness, what if God is nothing? What if He works for all of you and He's not going to work for me? Or what if I've gone to the ocean with a thimble and that's all I've gotten? Can I really go to the ocean without a container of my making? And you consider that. And it brings me back full circle. If God is nothing, I'm screwed, because there is nothing I can do about me drinking again. I hate to say it, but there's a dangerous message nowadays in Alcoholics Anonymous where we live. They're telling new people like me, just don't drink, no matter what. And you know what? They didn't tell me that where I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. They told me, you probably will drink again no matter what, because that's the truth of your life, unless something major happens here in Alcoholics Anonymous. Because you know what? I can't just not drink no matter what. I drink no matter what. And for some reason I haven't had to do that. But I can't do that. It's a very awkward position. I think the steps are like doors, and one closes behind you and the next one is automatically opened. And I was open to looking at a new conception. I think the idea that we're supposed to choose God as everything or nothing took it beyond my head. Didn't have to put it in a box. Didn't have to have God understood before I could go to the third step. I don't understand everything. Good. I say to Don, I'm terribly afraid of my own mind. You have good reason to be. I feel inferior and insecure. He says, do you know why you feel inferior and insecure? And I'm waiting for some great answer like I used to go to therapy for. And I said, no, why? He said, because you're inferior and you're insecure. That's too simple for a complicated mind like mine. I probably had to unlearn more than I've learned, because I absolutely know this. Studying this book is of absolutely no avail if it doesn't get you excited about doing what's in this book. 2 kids growing up. Both want the same thing. They want to have a spiritual experience. One goes off to college, learns everything there is to learn about what it would be like to have a spiritual experience. Dot the I's, cross the T's, reference this to that, work it all out. Becomes a teacher in the Vatican, teaching priests. Probably knows more about God than everyone in this room put together will ever know about God. And his other brother leaves school, goes to Appalachia, never goes back to school, and finds some women. I'm sorry, that's the orgasm story. And has a spiritual experience. It's real similar, kind of. You're never going to know what it's like to have an orgasm until you have one. You could learn everything in there is to learn about it in the world. And the other brother goes off and has a spiritual experience. Which one knows more about what it would be like to have one? But of course I got into the book and I went to a book study. My home group read it every year over and over and over. But we did what was in there. And we watched it happening in our lives. People in situations that they think there is absolutely no way I can get out of this. And I woke up to that one day, 2.5 years sober. And this is what my head said. There are so many lies and so much harm and so much stuff that you haven't been honest about. There is no way you're going to get out of this one. Even this process isn't going to work. And that was a terrifying day. And I went back to it because I drank enough alcohol. Not out of virtue. If the first step experience that I've had over and over and over and over means anything at all, it means that all the virtue that's inside of me just gets squeezed right out until it's about me and a bottle of alcohol, and all I have to do is answer 2 questions. Can you keep yourself from taking off the top of that bottle and taking a drink? And if you take a drink, will you be able to control how much you're going to drink? And I have to answer no to either one. I can't do that. And all of a sudden, the description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and my personal adventures before the first drink and after the first drink made clear 3 pertinent ideas. And I had heard that in every meeting I'd ever been to in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I didn't have a clue what that paragraph before the ABCs meant. And I got to that point in the book with my sponsor and had experienced, not just learned what that book said. You know, because I'm the guy that's become every group I've ever been around and bought the company line. How do I know I haven't done that in Alcoholics Anonymous? You talk about some craving, you talk about some obsession. Maybe I've just fit that into my drinking so it sounds good so I can be one of the club. I have to go back to what my drinking was really like. And you know what? In going through the first 3 steps, I absolutely had an experience with what they mean by that paragraph before the ABCs. That the description of the alcoholic is me. And the chapter to the agnostic is where I found the second step and began to come to believe. And that my personal adventures before the first drink and after the first drink made clear 3 pertinent ideas. That I'm an alcoholic and I can't manage my own life, drunk or sober. I'm the guy that thought the first step meant that little dash in between the first part and the second part meant fill in the blank. And I'm going to do it like this. I admit I'm powerless over alcohol, and that's why my life is unmanageable until I had some time trying to manage my life on my own power, further away from my last drink than I'd ever been, and was screwed. That no human power can relieve my alcoholism. You can't save me. I can't save me. No one has ever been able to save me. Then there was a tricky one. The beginning of the chapter of the agnostic. Do I believe I suffer from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer? They taught me to turn every statement the book makes into a question for me, and that thing will come alive if I relate to it experientially rather than intellectually. Maybe I don't suffer from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Maybe it's like they tell us nowadays in AA. Maybe it's just low self-esteem and I can work on it, or at least you can help me work on it. Maybe it is just low self-esteem. And I start to write inventory, and I find out that I have probably had more esteem for myself than anyone in the world will ever have for me, and drank. And I have probably had less esteem for myself than anyone in the world will ever have for me, and I didn't drink. I got a little bit more than low self-esteem. I heard George Carlin not too long ago, and he talked about if you change the name of the condition, you can change the condition. And what we as Americans do with language. And I thought to because we live in a society where we want to shield each other from death. And I thought to myself, my God, that's what we do in Alcoholics Anonymous. Rather than admit to you that I have a spiritual malady, a physical craving, and a mental obsession that I can do nothing about, nor can any other human power, I'd rather say I have obsessive-compulsive behavior coupled with low self-esteem. And today I'm working on it. I write little affirmations in my mirror, and my group helps me work. God, the people I come with just tease the shit out of me and insult me to my face. They don't help me with my self-esteem. Nor do they think that they could help me with my self-esteem. Thank God. One more pat on the back and I was ready to just die. I didn't need any more pats on the back. I hugged my way through therapy for 12 years, dying. Could never go to my father's grave. Sit in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, somebody says, you can't make amends to someone who's dead. Selling the program short. And thank God Don said, you just go to his grave and do what you did with everybody else face to face. And I got free. I got free of my oldest resentment. So, when I became convinced of 3 pertinent ideas, and I met the first requirement of the 3rd step, that pissed me off. I'd been to a lot of meetings on the 3rd step. No one ever told me there was a requirement to take the 3rd step until we got to it in the book. And it says the first requirement is that I be convinced that my life run on my will cannot be a success. And from seeing what I saw in the first 2 steps, I was absolutely convinced that my life, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, run on my will, had not, nor probably ever will be, successful. And I met the first requirement of the 3rd step. We did the prayer, which has nothing to do with the decision. I mean, I didn't know that the decision wasn't the prayer. They told me I was supposed to decide about from hereafter in this life. I get to decide about what I want God to be. The grace involved in that. That He could direct my life and I could continue to be the actor. Because I am, you know. And they describe me real well in there. Oh, I hate that page. I want to run the whole show. I want to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery. Even when my motives are good, I'm a producer of confusion. Wait a minute. Even when trying to be kind, even in my very best moments, I'm a producer of confusion. Holy moly. And that's me. God could possibly direct my life. God could be the boss and I could be the agent. Never have to work for anybody ever again. My God, Don told me that was true. The 2nd or 3rd time I went through the work, I haven't worked for anybody since. But that principle in my life. God could be the father and I could be the child. Then we did the prayer. Nothing happened. Got up off my knees. I said, Don, if that was just a decision, then how do I turn it over? The most thrown around cliche in Alcoholics Anonymous. You're sitting in a meeting, you're really in trouble, you share your terrible problem, and some guy in the back of the room says, just turn it over. Like I'm supposed to understand how to do that. My God, I'm just new in Alcoholics Anonymous. If I knew how to turn it over, I wouldn't be here. And you just tell me, turn it over. I thought maybe on my 2nd birthday they'd show me some secret button you press to just turn everything over. And you know what? When I got up off my knees, when I got up off my knees and I asked the greatest question you could ever ask in Alcoholics Anonymous, if the person you're asking has a real answer for you, and I said, then how do you turn it over? He didn't throw some cliche at me. He said, son, can you count from 4 to 9? And the funny thing is, 8 years ago, I could count from 4 to 9. 8 years later, I have a real hard time counting from 4 to 9. Because he said, the way you turn your will and your life over to the care of God is steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And I found those steps to be direct acts against my will, contrary to my life. That's how I turn it over. And I'm here to tell you, to write inventory the way it is in that big book is absolutely against my will. Contrary to the way I've lived for 30 years. You mean I'm going to see where I play a part with every resentment I ever have? You mean shit doesn't happen? I heard George Carlin and he said, you never see a shit happens bumper sticker on a Rolls Royce, do you? And here I am going through my life, writing down all these resentments, and it was always you doing it to me. I was an unbelievable victim and thought I was a hell of a guy getting over on other people. And I was a victim. And you know what? There's a line in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous that set me free when I started to do the 4th column of the resentment inventory. Because you know what I find out? With every time I think I'm writing about someone that's doing something to me, shit doesn't happen. I bring it on myself. I am an extreme example of self-will run riot, and the trick to that is I usually don't think so. My troubles are of my own making, and I got free on that line. The greatest statement of hope in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Our troubles are basically of our own making. They arise out of self. And I experienced that line. I didn't read it. I didn't study it. I didn't look the words up in the dictionary. I experienced the freedom of that statement in the fourth column of the resentment inventory and saw that I had a part and brought on almost every resentment I've ever had in my life. I either played a part or brought it on. So I go back to my oldest resentment of all time. The oldest one I've been able to trace back through all those years of therapy. I resented my father when I was 5 years old because he was 57 when I was born. So by the time I was 5, he was 60-something. 62 years old, and you're 5. And I resent my dad in the first column because he doesn't play baseball with me like the other fathers do. And it affects my self-esteem. It affects how I look to my buddies, my pride. It affects what I want. It affects what I need. It affects every area of my life. And then got to see what I was into when I can remember my first resentment of all time. I wanted to play God. I knew how old he should be. I knew what he should do. I knew how he should act. I knew how he should talk because I was terribly afraid and couldn't even see that I had 2 older brothers that played baseball with me whenever I wanted and a father that was a very wise man. And what used to cause me great pain, him being 57 years old when I was born, now gives me great hope. I would like to be able to do what my father was doing when he was 57 years old. I have great admiration for the man, which used to be nothing but blame. Some of that got free in the fourth column. Most of it got free in amends. To write fear. To see that there's fear behind every resentment that I've ever had. And then look at that in a 2-column fear inventory. And see that for every fear that I have, behind every resentment I have, self-reliance fails. And what I try to do is control fear. And that fear isn't just an emotion. And that fear doesn't just happen here. That fear is manufactured here. Didn't we ourselves set the ball rolling? Is it possible that fear is a conscious decision? Now, I look at my fear list and I say to myself, I never decided to be afraid of heights or snakes or daddy or looking bad. I never decided. What do you mean fear is a conscious decision? My friend said to me, there is a conscious decision you made a long time ago which set up every fear you've ever had since. And I said, what was that? And he said, to rely on yourself. And I saw that the decision to rely on self was a conscious decision, and it set up every fear I've ever had. And then to look at my relationships. I thought the sex inventory would... Well, 2 terrible things happened the first time, and they were absolutely wonderful. I stopped writing in the middle of the fear inventory. And I almost got arrested for some gambling I had done early in my sobriety. And I ran out to Don's house and I said, I'm going to get arrested for gambling from 7-10 months ago. He said, great, what a wonderful thing to happen in the middle of a fear inventory that you won't write. I said, what do you mean? That doesn't feel good when you say that. No, I didn't say that. I said, what do you mean that's a great thing? He said, you'll either run or you'll finish your fear inventory. You've been running all your life. And I finished my fear inventory. And you would think I would have learned my lesson. Well, being an alcoholic, I don't learn my lesson, so I get to the sex inventory. And I stop writing. We're talking just a few weeks. You hit that bottom in Alcoholics Anonymous, you don't get much grace from there on. And in the middle of my sex inventory that I wasn't writing the first time, 2 women called me the same day, pregnant, for my behavior in my early sobriety. And I called Don. I said, my God, 2 women called me. They're both pregnant. I'm in the middle of this sex inventory. What should I do? He said, what a wonderful thing to happen in the middle of a sex inventory. I said, what do you mean? He said, you'll either run or you'll write. And I finished my sex inventory. Haven't got anybody pregnant since. Haven't had the chance to get anybody pregnant since. To take that to one man and read the whole deal, there's a part of the inventory you don't hear talked about a lot at the end of the sex inventory. The only part of the inventory he warned me about. I'm done with my sex inventory. I call him up. I'm ready to fist step. He said, no, there's one more thing. Read where it says in the book. I said, what's that? He said, go back to the sex inventory and look at those 9 questions that you answered for each relationship and look at where you wrote, what should I have done instead? And ask God to help mold an ideal for your future. And write a couple pages about your chosen ideal for the future. And I think you don't hear a lot about that kind of an inventory talked about, period, let alone the ideal, because people don't want to face what goes on once you write that ideal and go against it. When to yield means heartache. I've experienced that. If our behavior doesn't change and we continue to harm others, we're quite sure to drink. If we're not sorry. He said, don't write that part of the inventory unless you're ready for that area of your life to change. Only part of the inventory he warned me about. And I wrote it. Because I drank enough alcohol. Even at that point, it wasn't based on virtue yet. And I took that inventory to his house and I started to read. I had the experience the day when I went out to with him to speak and experienced that and finished it the next day or so. And went home and probably had the most peaceful, personal experience with myself and God that I've ever had in my life in 6 and 7. I love in California when I hear people in meetings and they're working steps 6 and 7 for the last 6 or 9 months. They're working on their defects, and their sponsors help them put them in order and what order they're going to work on them, and they work on one at a time. And they're always working on something. I've tried to do that in sobriety, and it's like one of those carnival games where you knock one down and the other one bounces up, and you knock that one down and the other one bounces up. That'll be the day that this guy ever removes any of his character defects or shortcomings. You know how you've worked 6 and 7? You're making a list of people you've harmed, and you're willing to go make amends to them. I think the experience at each step is wonderful, but I think the miracle of each step is when you're in the action of the next. And I found myself making a list. And I found myself going through an exercise that is absolutely in the book, and I didn't think it was the first time I read the book. We're supposed to consider the list, asking ourselves, do we feel diffident about going to any of them? And he told me to go through that list and picture that person face to face and ask myself, am I willing to do whatever that person says to make right the wrong? And I marked it, plus or minus. I'm either willing or I'm not. And I go back to it, I'm not so overwhelmed by this list like I was when I finished the 8th step, before I did that exercise. And I said, Don, how am I going to get the willingness to do the ones I'm not willing to do? He said, by doing the ones you're willing to do. And we looked at each one, how it should be done. And he gave me a format for making amends, whether it's a letter or a phone call or face-to-face. If at all possible, I like to see him face-to-face. And he gave me a format for doing that. I should tell you why I'm here. And I should help you to understand that this is a life and death mission. That me not drinking again depends on my willingness to make these amends. Why I'm here in front of you. I should tell you the harm that I'm clear on. And I get clear on that from the 4th column. And sometimes what I see in the 3rd column nowadays. The harm that I'm clear on, I should talk to you about. And then I should ask you, is there any other harm? And then because I'm terribly insensitive, I should say, now that we have all the harm out on the table, do you need to tell me how any of that hurt you? And I had an amazing experience. There were some amends I thought were big deals, and they were really going to slam me. My God, they didn't even remember me. It was all in my head. Then I had some I thought were no big deal at all. I had really hurt them. And then I asked the magic question that the book talks about. What can I do to make it right? Can you forgive me? I worked with some stuff this year from a friend of mine. To be able to go, the book talks about going in a helpful and forgiving spirit. And he told me to go back to the second column of the resentment inventory and search for the truth to help me find the forgiveness I need to go to them. And what had become a lie had some truth in it. See, I write inventory, and all of a sudden each column becomes a lie when I write the next column, until I get down to what I was really up to. And in that 8th step, and in making those amends, I get to face what I was up to that I saw in my inventory. And my life starts to change. And I would like to say that I've done real well with 10 and 11. I have continued to take personal inventory, and I do try to continue to make amends, but it seems like that blast of power that you get every time you go through the first 9 steps, for some reason it kind of puddles out. And I think that's a similar experience to the people that I know that continue to want more in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I go back through the first 9 steps. This year I made a personal commitment that I want to spend a little more time finishing amends. I want to finish amends. I finished my first ones. I've piddled around with the second 2 or 3. I still have some from my last inventory. And I have some from a current inventory that I did this year, where I had to do some different things because I needed some people in California where I've lived for the last 4 years to get to know me on that level. I went through the work this year with 8 other people. We broke that group of 8 into groups of 4, and we fist-stepped with those 4 other people in one day, hearing theirs and hearing mine, with 4 different people, and fist-stepped with 2 people the next day. So in a weekend, I fist-stepped with 6 different people. Had an amazing experience, and the willingness and the power to make amends this time, even though there aren't that many, is there. And the virtue isn't sneaking back in, because I think that basic admission about me and alcohol has stayed in place this time. I can't keep that there, but it seems to be there with me. This idea that I'm like other people presently has pretty much been smashed. When I'm angry, I know it's not just anger. When I'm watching for things in the 10th step as I go throughout the day, and it's fear or anger or resentment or whatever it is, my selfishness or my dishonesty, the things the 10th step asked me to look for, to watch for, I know that those things aren't the bottom line. They might be the bottom line for my neighbor, but the bottom line for me is alcohol, because I'm an alcoholic. If it goes much further, I'll drink. I do not do this work based on the emotional state that I'm in, nor do I base my spiritual condition on how I feel most of the time. I'm no longer worshiping circumstance. I started to hear something in Alcoholics Anonymous from the podium, and I started to ask myself some questions when I would hear people talk about, I know God's working in my life because I pulled up to the street today and there was a parking lot sent direct from God just for me. And I thought to myself, you do that, don't you, Joe? And I said, yeah. What are you worshiping? God or circumstance? The chapter of the Agnostic talks about those kind of worships. I tell you that I'm doing good because I feel good, and I know God's working in my life because I feel good. And I realized one day, you know what? God better be there when you're not feeling so good. And I stopped taking my spiritual temperature based on my emotional state. To continue to seek those things. To want to grow in understanding and effectiveness is an amazing thing for a guy like me. To have the greatest joy of my life, to sit in my living room or in a workshop and work with a group of people and watch those miracles happen. Or sit in my living room and watch a guy 10 years around the program has never had 60 days. Paralyzed from the waist down because he snuck up to a friend of his one time and stuck his finger in his back. And it was the kind of area of Los Angeles where you don't walk up to a friend and stick your finger in his back and pretend like you're robbing him, because his friend turned around and shot his best friend and didn't know who it was. And he was paralyzed from the waist down by his best friend. To watch the truth come into the room that God didn't do that to him. To watch somebody find out what's wrong with them. To watch their lives turn around. To watch little black Crip members of the Crips, in Los Angeles, California, just catch on fire and go all over Los Angeles making amends. To watch a kid that literally drives through Los Angeles looking for roast beef stands and convenience stores, asking God in front of each one, did I ever rob that place? Making amends is the joy of my life. And I'm not the kind of guy that should enjoy that kind of stuff. I want it to be for me. What am I going to get? To continue to do this work is a hell of a deal. And all you had to do was drink enough alcohol to need the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you for letting me share.